Okay. We are going to begin chapter 12 today. So this is our second to last chapter of the course. And here we will learn exactly what the role of the Fed is in terms of helping economies climb out of recessions or to help economies fight inflation. Okay? So this is what we've learned so far. The Fed can change the money supply in three principal ways, right? It can either buy bonds or sell them. Now, if the Fed is buying bonds, what is that going to do to the money supply? Raise it or lower it? If the Fed buys bonds, what's going to happen to the money supply? It's going to rise. If the Fed's selling bonds, the money supply is going to fall. Now, this buying and selling of bonds has a name, right? What is it called? When the Fed buys and sells bonds, it's called some type of operation of the Fed. Open market operations. Correct? Now, do you remember that in the structure of the Fed there is a committee? It's called the Federal Open Market Committee, or FOMC. This is a committee within the Fed that makes decisions about open market operations. So this is the main way in which the Fed can alter the nation's money supply, correct? We spent the whole of last week studying this stuff. There is a second way in which the Fed can change the money supply, and that is by changing the RRR. Now, I want to make sure that you understand how that works. Remember the formula we have, which is that the change in the money supply is equal to the change in the monetary base times the money multiplier. Now, what's the formula for the money multiplier? We have two different formulas if you recall. One of them assumes that there are no cash leaks and the banks are fully lent up, and the other one relaxes these assumptions. Let's work with the former definition, assuming that there are no cash leaks and banks are fully lent up. In that case, the money multiplier is 1 divided by the required reserve ratio. Is that correct? So if the Fed wishes to raise the money supply, what would it do to the RRR? Remember, the RRR is something that the Fed controls. Is that correct? So you tell me, from this equation, if the money supply, or rather, I put it wrongly, what if I want the change in the money supply to be positive? In other words, I'd like the money supply to rise. I'd like the change to be a positive change. In other words, what I'd like to do here is make this positive, you see. So in order to do that, well, the Fed can buy bonds, for instance, and that would make this positive, correct? Or the Fed could not buy bonds, but simply lower this. Is that correct? Because if the RRR were lowered, what happens to 1 divided by the RRR? What happens to the entire fraction if the denominator is reduced? Well, wouldn't that cause the entire fraction to increase? Is that correct? So that too would have an effect of increasing the money supply, wouldn't it? So that's our second method. The Fed can change the money supply by altering the required reserve ratio. Now, what's the intuition behind this? Why would lowering the RRR cause the money supply to increase? We've learned that bank lending is crucial in this process of the creation of money. Because every time a bank lends you money and you spend the money in Best Buy, for instance, remember that story? Well, that causes the sum total of the checkable deposits of the country to go up because Best Buy is going to deposit that sum in its bank account. So by this token then, bank lending results in an increase in the money supply. Now by lowering the required reserve ratio, the Fed makes it easier for banks to lend. Because what is the required reserve ratio? It's the minimum percentage of its customers' deposits the banks can't touch, that they have to keep as a cash reserve. Now if this fraction, if this RRR were lowered, banks could now lend out a larger proportion of their customers' deposits. There'd be more bank lending, in other words. And this extra lending is then going to result in an increase in the money supply. So that's how that works. And the third way in which the Fed can alter the money supply is by changing the discount rate. And do you recall what the discount rate is? The discount rate is the interest rate charged by the Fed on loans made to banks. See, just as you and I borrow money from the Fed, or rather from our bank, when we need to borrow, we borrow from our bank. When our bank needs to borrow, it borrows from the Fed. And the interest rate the Fed charges is called the discount rate, as we learned. So if the Fed wanted to increase the money supply, in other words, if the Fed wanted to encourage bank lending to you and I, what the Fed may do is lower the discount rate, make it cheaper for banks to borrow from the Fed. This way, banks would be encouraged to borrow cheaply from the Fed at a low interest, at a low discount rate, and then lend that same money out to you and I at a higher interest rate. You follow me? And this lending to us would cause the money supply to increase. Right? So if the Fed wishes to increase the money supply, the Fed could lower this discount rate, this interest rate that it charges banks on loans made to them. On the other hand, if the Fed wishes to decrease the money supply, the Fed could raise that discount rate. When that interest rate is raised, banks like IBC and Chase would like to repay their debt to the Fed. Repay it quickly because otherwise they'd have to pay this high interest. And how do banks lay hands on funds to repay the Fed? By calling in its own loans, by asking people who've borrowed money from it in the past to repay. So you'll get a call saying, please repay the $900 that you borrowed. So you go to your aunt and take money from her to, remember that story? And this whole thing works in reverse then, and the money supply shrinks. Right? So these are the three principal ways in which the Fed can alter the nation's money supply. But that brings us to the question, we know the Fed can change the money supply, but why would it want to? Why would it wish to change the money supply? And that is the key question that we are now going to deal with in chapter 12. Okay? In chapter 11, we learned how the Fed can change the money supply. Okay? So in chapter 11, we learned how the Fed can change the money supply. This was chapter 11, and this is going to be the material in chapter 12. We're going to look at exactly what the Fed's motive is going to be. Why is it going to bother to change the money supply? Okay? And this is our crucial diagram from this chapter, chapter 12. And let me exit this and go to my drawing board and explain to you exactly why the Fed would wish to change the money supply. Now let's say that we have an economy in recession, and I'm going to draw the diagram for an economy in recession. This is a familiar diagram. Real GDP, price level, aggregate demand curve, aggregate supply curve. This here is equilibrium real GDP. Is that correct? And let's mark off in this diagram full employment real GDP or potential real GDP. And this gap here, as you know, is the what gap? Recessionary gap. Exactly. So this is an economy in recession. And we know that in order to eliminate this recession, the demand curve, the AD curve, has to be shifted. And it has to be shifted where? The AD curve has to be shifted all the way here. Is that correct? So if the AD curve was shifted to the right like that, there would be a new equilibrium right here, and then equilibrium GDP will basically equal potential GDP. And that recessionary gap will have been eliminated. Is that correct? So in order to get rid of this recession, we need to stimulate AD. And remember, AD consists of C, I, G, and these are the four components of AD. Now, this is the crucial diagram that we keep coming back to. This, by the way, is called the goods market. So this is the diagram for the goods market. Right, now we know what the government can do to stimulate AD. What can the government do to stimulate AD? The government can raise that and or cut taxes. Is that right? And what kind of policy is that called? Expansionary fiscal policy. Is that correct? Expansionary, because this is policy designed to expand equilibrium GDP, to narrow the recessionary gap. So this is what the government does, right? Now, what can the Fed do is the question. Fed is our other player here. And some people argue it's the more important player than the government. So what can the Fed do? Now, before I address that, I'd like to remind you of the connection between the interest rate and aggregate demand. Now, what is this connection? How can the interest rate affect aggregate demand? For instance, if the interest rate were lowered, which of these components here, C, I, G, X minus M, which of them would be affected? And how? If interest rates in the economy fell, would consumption spending, for instance, be affected? Would it? Yes? Well, ask yourself the question, if the interest rate were low, would you be more likely to take out a car loan to buy a new car? That's what I'm getting at. You follow me? If the interest rate's low, wouldn't you like to avail of that low interest rate to perhaps borrow money to go shopping with? Would you be more likely to use your credit card, for instance? Yes. So when the interest rate falls, consumption spending tends to go up. Consumption spending on the big ticket items in particular, the expensive items that we tend to buy on credit, like cars, correct? So a lower interest rate stimulates consumption spending, and that would then shift the AD curve to the right, wouldn't it? Yes? Now, is there a connection between the rate of interest and investment spending? Would that be affected too? Yes, because businesses too often borrow money to buy new machines. Correct? You make the terms of that borrowing cheaper, easier, and businesses will be more likely then to take out business loans to buy new machinery. And so a lowering of the interest rate is likely to stimulate investment spending also. And that would cause AD to go up. Anything else? Would any of the other components of AD be affected? What about X minus M? Would a cut in the interest rate affect net exports? And here we have a story also that I've mentioned in class. You see, if US interest rates fall, then the US will no longer be an attractive destination for foreign money looking for a high rate of return. You see, there is a pool of money out there belonging to wealthy individuals the world over that simply moves from country to country looking for a high interest rate. And if the US interest rate falls, this money will be pulled out of the States. For instance, many rich Mexicans who have money lying in American banks will now find America not an attractive destination because US interest rates have fallen. They will try to pull their money out. And how would they pull their money out? They would try to convert their dollars in American banks back into pesos, for instance. Right? So you need to think now of a market for dollars. So this is the market for dollars. So here we have the quantity of dollars, and here we have the peso price of $1. This, of course, another name for this is the exchange rate, isn't it? Right? And we have a demand curve in this market, and we have a supply curve in this market. But now, since these rich Mexicans are selling their dollars, converting them back into pesos, what happens in this diagram? You can think of this as the supply curve of pesos shifting to the right. As more people are trying to sell their dollars in order to get their money out of the States. Now, this rightward shift in the supply curve for pesos is going to cause, what is this going to do? It's going to cause the exchange rate to fall. Fewer pesos to a dollar. In other words, the dollar weakens. Now, when the dollar weakens, what happens to net exports? When the dollar becomes weaker, don't our products seem cheaper to Mexicans? Right? So that would cause our exports to go up. And it would cause Mexican goods, for instance, to be more expensive for us. So we would import less. And so with X going up and M going down, what happens to X minus M? X minus M goes up, and AD goes up. So my point here is that a lowering of interest rates in the States results in aggregate demand being stimulated. You follow me? So there is this connection between the interest rate and aggregate demand. What's that connection? Let me circle this for you. So I'm talking about this connection here. And what is the nature of that connection? When the interest rate falls, aggregate demand rises. That's the connection. And that's central to our discussion now. Because we will now find out, we will learn now, that the interest rate can in fact, or is in fact affected by the money supply. So this is going to be, this connection here is going to be what chapter 12 deals with. You see? Now we know that the Fed can affect the money supply. We've learned this. And it can do so in three ways. What are the three ways? Open market operations, the RRR, and the discount rate. So these are the three ways in which the Fed can affect the money supply. Now we will learn that the money supply can affect the interest rate, and the interest rate can affect AD. Do you follow? So if there is a recession and we want to shift the AD curve rightwards like this, what do we want to happen to the interest rate? Decrease, exactly. And therefore, something will have to happen to money supply to cause that interest rate to decrease. And that's where the Fed comes in. Do you follow me? So this is going to be the subject matter of chapter 12. Okay? What's the connection between the money supply and the interest rate? And let me go back to my PowerPoint presentation. And this is going to be our key diagram here. This is the diagram that explains the connection between the money supply and the interest rate. Now this is called the money market, as opposed to the goods market. The goods market is this one here. A DAS, real GDP price level. That's your goods market. But this diagram below is the diagram for what's called the money market. So in this diagram, we have a demand curve for money. It's the money demand curve M superscript D. And then we have a money supply curve, which is vertical, right? And this will be explained shortly. This is the money supply curve. And as in all markets, we have equilibrium, where the money demand curve and the money supply curve intersect. And that intersection happens right there. So this is where we have equilibrium in the money market. And that equilibrium gives rise to an equilibrium interest rate. So this is going to be the equilibrium interest rate. Do you follow me? Now, if there's a recession on, in other words, if in the goods market up here, if you have a recessionary gap, in other words, that's Y star and this is YF, and you have that recessionary gap that must be narrowed by shifting the AD curve rightwards, what would the Fed do in the money market? Remember, the Fed would want to do something to this equilibrium interest rate in order to stimulate consumption spending, investment spending, and net exports. What would it want to do to the interest rate? Lower it, is that correct? Right? Now, in order to lower it, the Fed would do what to the money supply? Because the money supply is what the Fed controls. So you tell me, by looking at this diagram, what would the Fed do to the money supply to cause the equilibrium interest rate R star to fall? Yeah, exactly, increase it, because increasing the money supply will shift this supply curve to the right like that, correct? And so we would have a new money supply curve like this. There would be a new equilibrium here, which would translate to a lower equilibrium real interest rate. You see that? So this is what the Fed is going to be up to in a recession then. The Fed would want to increase the money supply, because that increase in the money supply is going to cause the equilibrium interest rate to fall. And that fall in the interest rate will cause consumption spending to go up, investment spending to go up, and also net exports to go up, meaning AD to go up, which is what we need in a recession. Correct? So this is going to be our critical diagram, and we'll spend the remainder of this class, and perhaps part of next class, discussing this diagram, the money market. But I hope you understand where we are going with this, correct? So once again, the whole point is that in a recession, demand has to be stimulated. What can the Fed do to stimulate demand? The Fed can cause the money supply to increase, because this increase is going to cause the equilibrium interest rate to fall. And we've learned that a lower interest rate stimulates consumption, investment spending, and also net exports. So let's now get behind this diagram, okay? That's been discussed here. So we have two kinds of monetary policy. We have expansionary monetary policy, And expansionary monetary policy would involve what happening to the money supply? Tell me. Would it be going up or going down? Going up, why? Because expansionary means increase. But remember, when we say expansionary, we're talking about increasing what? Increasing Y star, not money supply necessarily. That's where the expansionary comes from. Expanding what? Expanding equilibrium real GDP. Now, would an increase in the money supply cause the equilibrium real GDP to go up? Would an increase in the money supply cause the equilibrium real GDP to go up is the question. Will it? Yes, it will, because we've learned that an increase in the money supply causes the equilibrium interest rate to fall, and a fall in the interest rate causes AD to rise because consumption, investment, and net exports are stimulated. Is that correct? So therefore, expansionary monetary policy is, in fact, a rise in money supply. Why? Because a rise in the money supply causes the interest rate to fall, and that then stimulates AD, which then in the goods market causes Y star to go up. Correct? So that's expansionary monetary policy. But also there is such a thing as contractionary monetary policy, just as there is contractionary fiscal policy. Contractionary fiscal policy is designed to do what? Contract equilibrium GDP, bring it down. So when would the government, when would the Fed pursue? Yes, when there is fear of inflation, correct? Because you see, in the goods market, AD and AS. If the AD curve shifts to the right like that, we have a rise in the equilibrium price level, as you can see. And that's inflation. So if you have a situation where the AD curve has been shifting to the right very rapidly, this would result in high demand pull inflation. Correct? To combat this inflation, the Fed would like to pursue contractionary policies, policies that would in fact dampen consumption, investment spending, and also net exports, in order to put the brakes on any rapid increase in AD. Right? So when the main fear is inflation and not unemployment, then the Fed would pursue contractionary monetary policy, which would involve the money supply reducing, because a fall in the money supply causes the interest rate to rise, and this then causes aggregate demand to fall. Right? Now we're going to get behind the money demand curve in the money market diagram. Once again, let me remind you what this curve looks like. You have the interest rate there, and you have the quantity of money here. And the money demand curve is negatively sloped like this. So let's understand this diagram. When the interest rate falls, why do people increase their quantity demanded of money? But before we do this, we need to understand exactly what our demand for money means. It says here, people may choose to hold their wealth in two forms. A, assets that yield a return. For example, an interest-earning asset such as a government bond. The second way of us keeping wealth is in the form of non-interest-earning money. Does this make sense? If we have a wealth, now wealth is different from income. Wealth is what you have saved up in the past, correct? If you have a certain amount of wealth, let's call it W, what we've just said is that this wealth can be held in two forms. It can be held in the form of money. Now what's money? What's the definition of money by the M1 definition? Cash, traveler's checks, or checkable deposits. So we can hold part of our wealth in these three forms. none of which earns us any interest, by the way. Correct? So money earns no interest, but we can choose to keep part of our wealth in that form. And the other form is in the form of some type of interest-earning asset, such as a government bond or government bonds. Now, of course, there are a variety of other interest-earning assets. But to keep things simple, we're going to assume here that we have this choice between money and bonds. Okay? So we can choose to hold our wealth in one of these two forms. Now, what does an individual's demand for money refer to? It says here, an individual's demand for money refers to the portion of her wealth that she chooses to hold in the form of non-interest earning money as opposed to government bonds. In other words, if I represent her wealth as that, if that W is her wealth, then her demand for money is going to be the part of her wealth that she chooses to hold in the form of money. So right away then, a person's demand for money can never exceed her wealth. Is that correct, Mac? What she can do at most is convert all her wealth into money and hold no bonds. Correct? So if I ask you, what is your demand for money? Your answer can't be, oh, infinite. It can't be, because what you can do at most is convert all your wealth into money. So if your wealth, let's say you're worth $1,000, your demand for money can never exceed $1,000. Is that correct? Because you could at most convert all your wealth into money. Otherwise, you could perhaps keep 300 of this $1,000 in cash form, and with the remaining 700, you could buy government bonds. So you have a 700-300 split there. Is that correct? It says here, so her demand for money may not exceed her wealth. Now, it says here, note that by demanding money, she forgoes some interest income. In other words, every time we hold $1 of money, we are giving up some interest income. Right? Because we could have held that dollar in the form of bonds instead. In other words, there is an opportunity cost, an implicit cost to holding money. And what is that implicit cost? Interest income given up. Do you follow me? So the rate of interest may be thought of as the price in an opportunity cost sense of holding money. It says this is why the vertical axis in the diagram on slide 3, or this diagram here, right here, this is why the vertical axis in this diagram measures the rate of interest, just as the vertical axis in most diagrams of demand and supply curves measures the price of the good. Correct? In most diagrams where we have a demand curve, the vertical axis measures price. Is that correct? So here in this diagram, we have the interest rate on the vertical axis. So therefore, the question is, can the interest rate be viewed as a price of money? And we say, yes, it is a price of money. It's a price in an opportunity cost sense, because what it represents is the interest income that the holder of money is giving up. You follow me? Because money earns no interest. Now, had that same dollar been held in the form of bonds, it would have earned the owner of that dollar some interest. Right? So the interest rate can be viewed as the price, then, of holding money. Do you follow me? So this is price in what sense? In an implicit cost sense. It's what's not coming into the person's pocket as a result of his holding money, not bonds. Right? Now, there are 3 reasons why people decide to hold money. Again, you have wealth. Wealth can be held in 2 forms: money, bonds. This earns no interest. So why hold money that earns no interest? You're losing interest income by holding money. So why do we then persist on holding money? Why do we continue? Why do we insist on holding money? And here are the reasons why. The first reason why we decide to hold money, even though we are losing some income, is what's called the transactions motive, transactions demand for money. It says here people hold a portion of their wealth in the form of money in order to purchase goods and services. This is why money was invented, if you recall. Money was invented in order for us to circumvent, to get around the problem of the double coincidence of wants of a barter economy, if you recall. Right? Money makes economic exchanges easier. So we hold a part of our wealth in the form of non-interest earning money simply so we can go shopping. That's called the transactions demand for money. Right? Let me exit this and go to my drawing board to talk about this transactions demand for money. If I were to draw a diagram like this, and here I have the interest rate, and here I have the quantity of money demanded for transactions. In other words, the quantity demanded money for this reason, to go shopping with. What would that curve look like? If the interest rate rises, would the quantity of money that we hold for going shopping, would that quantity of money be affected in any way? How is that? Well, the higher the interest rate, the higher the implicit cost of holding money. The more expensive holding money becomes. Am I correct? Expensive in what sense? Expensive in the sense of interest income being given up. So the higher the interest rate, the more expensive it is to hold money for transaction purposes. And so we expect people to hold a smaller quantity of money for transactions purposes. This logic would give us a transactions demand curve for money that looks like that. So this is money demanded for transactions. The higher the rate of interest, the lower the quantity of money demanded for transactions purposes. In other words, we go from this point on the demand curve, we move to a point perhaps like that. Does that make sense? So this is what the transactions demand curve for money looks like. The higher the interest rate, the more expensive it is to hold money, because the more interest income you are giving up by holding non-interest earning money. Right? So this is the money demanded for transactions. Now, let me ask you another question. Is there a relationship between this and income? Is there a link between the demand for money for transactions and the individual's income? Let's say we have two people and one person has more income than the other. Who is likely to demand more money for transactions purposes? Well, the person who wants to do more shopping. Am I correct? So who is the person who wants to demand more money for transactions purposes? The person who wants to shop more. And who wants to shop more? The person with more income or the person with less income? Yes. So a rise in income causes the transactions demand for money to go up. Simply because the more your income, the more shopping you wish to do, the higher your consumption spending, in other words. Correct? And the higher your consumption spending, the more money you need in your pockets or in your checking account or in the form of traveler's checks to go shopping with. So in this diagram, if we were to raise the income in the economy, in other words, if we were to raise what's called aggregate income, and another name for aggregate income is GDP. if real GDP were raised, what would happen in this diagram? So let's say the prevailing interest rates are 1, and at this interest rate, the quantity of money demanded for transactions purposes is MD1. What would happen to that MD1 if GDP goes up? Now, GDP is not in this diagram. It's behind the scenes, right? Now, GDP is everyone's income. Am I correct? From our circular flow of income idea. So if GDP were raised, what would happen to this diagram? Well, at the same interest rate, people would now demand a larger amount of money. Why? Because with GDP going up, real income going up, in other words, people would want to shop more. And in order to shop more, they would need to hold more money. Is that correct? So instead of demanding the old MD1, they would now demand a new MD2. This becomes the new interest rate money demand combination. Now that point doesn't lie out there in space. Instead, it lies on a whole new transactions demand curve for money. And that new curve is like this. So what we've learned here is that when GDP goes up, the demand curve for money held for transactions purposes shifts to the right. We have an increase in the transactions demand for money when GDP goes up. Agreed? And at this point, I will stop since we just have a minute left. Okay. Stop here today.